you know, but I do a lot of visits at schools in addition to library visits and book clubs. And one thing I've learned is that you can't tell by looking at the student whether or not you're connecting with them, because the student that's sitting there looking the most rapt to your conversation is not always the one that's the most connected. And I was at a school, and there was a youngster there, a young boy. He could not sit still for the life of me. He was just moving, and he was all over the place. And I said, oh my goodness, he's not getting anything out of this, you know. And so after I finished my presentation, and I usually have a Q&A like I'm going to have tonight, so I asked the youngsters, are there any questions? His was the first hand to go up. I said, okay, what is he going to ask? Probably something totally irrelevant. But he said, Mrs. Elster, when you write your books, do you get lonely? Wasn't that a marvelous question? Because I said, oh my gosh, here I'm thinking these terrible things about this kid, and he asked this very astute, very sensitive question. And I bring that up because, yes, being a writer is a very lonely profession. And I enjoy coming out to events like this because I do get to connect with, hopefully, if you aren't my readers yet, your potential readers. We're going to have a book sale and signing afterwards. And I get to connect with people and talk and hear your questions and hear your comments. And it's just a thrill. So I thank Margie for inviting me, and Christina for her contacts with the Novi Observer Eccentric. I don't know if anyone had a chance to read the article. But Julie Brown, a marvelous journalist, she interviewed me and did a marvelous article. And you can get it online, and it's in this week's paper. I have a soft spot for libraries, so if at all possible, I always try to work out an invitation that I get. And when I heard from Margie here from the Novi Library, I was glad. She contacted me early enough. As she said, even before the book got its award or anything, she had contacted me. I like to show when I'm at libraries. Here's an article. Here's the online copy from the New York Times. And it doesn't matter if you can see the photo or not, but this is a photo of some youngsters in South Africa. And they organized a march. What do you think they're marching about? Anybody guess?
Closing up their library.
What, you guessed it right, hit the nail right on the head. They said, we want more information and knowledge. These are 9 and 10-year-olds. And it just broke my heart when I saw this article, and you know, they have smiles on their faces and whatnot, because we have libraries like this all through metropolitan Detroit. And we really take them for granted. And here are youngsters, thousands of them. There were over 1,000 youngsters marching because they want what we have right here. And so I always try to remind people, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but just to encourage youngsters, adults, who cares, Generation X, whatever, to really take advantage of what you have here and encourage your peers to take advantage of programs such as what you have here tonight, because it's not available everywhere in the world. And it's good for us to remember that. And this is a beautiful facility too, but it's good for us to remember that some places in the world would be glad to have just a shack with a few libraries in it. As you can tell, I spend a lot of time reading newspapers and online, and this was from 2 years ago. And it says, 50 years after integration, Ole Miss grapples with history. And this was celebrating the 50th anniversary of the integration of the University of Mississippi by James Meredith. And this article wasn't really focusing on that, but focusing on the conversation that took place around that. Because many people felt that too much attention, if you can place too much attention, was being put on Mr. Meredith's acts, very courageous acts in integrating the University of Mississippi, and not enough information was being shared about all the things that led up to that point. And it's a very valid point, because it just didn't happen that he walked up to the door and integrated the school. It just didn't happen. There were decades and decades of work that took place before then. And I like to share that story because that's what I try to do with my writing, with The Colored Car and its companion book, Who's Jim Hines. I try to tell the backstory, okay, because many people think that the civil rights movement started just with the Montgomery boycott in 1955, and there was a lot that took place before then, many, many decades. And when I approach these in my books, I try to do what I call time travel. Now, I know I have trouble with movies when there's time travel going back and forth. My husband and son, they laugh at me because I just don't get it. But there are time travel movies now, Terminator, some of the young kids know probably the Terminator, or the Star Trek movies, where you go back in time. I had a situation, I have another series of books called JoJo in the City, and they're 4 volumes, and I was invited to an elementary school in Memphis, Tennessee, to do a day's presentation on this series. And I came the night before, and the librarian or media specialist met me at the airport with her husband, and they took me out to dinner, very nice restaurant, before they took me to the hotel. But I noticed from that point on, everywhere we went, she always introduced me like this. Oh, this is Mrs. Elster. She's a Yankee. And I thought, oh my gosh, where am I? If this is a time warp or something, I felt like I was having time travel in America. But that got me thinking, what do you think about when you think about time travel? Where are you going? You know, where are you putting people? And that's what I'm going to do now, time travel. Since this is, I'm doing this for African American History Month, I thought I would bring this book. This is by a physicist, and he happens to be African American. His name is Ronald Mallett. So I hope you have his book in your library here. You can see if they do. It's called Time Traveler. But he has done some groundbreaking research on time travel. And it seems obvious when you say it, but what he realized and what he determined through all of his calculations was that anyone that makes a time machine, you will never be able to go farther back in time than whenever that time machine was created. Now, he got interested in physics and time travel because his father died when he was 9 years old, and he wanted desperately to see his father again. And that's why he went into physics, that's why he studied math, because he was determined to make a time machine so he could see his father again. So his groundbreaking research really was kind of heartbreaking for him because he realized he will not be able to see his father again. But it's groundbreaking because one day they will make a time machine based upon his research. So I just wanted, since this is African American History Time, almost African American History Month, Time Traveler by Ronald Mallett. Make sure you have it here in the library. So, but this is what I do. It's a journey through time when I'm doing my writing. And as I said, especially since this is Martin Luther King Day, I want to make sure that everyone understands that the civil rights movement just did not take place during 1955. It didn't just start. It was decades before. And I have here, I have some photos here, and if you can't see them too well, you can come back afterwards, after my presentation. But here I am sitting in the bus, the actual bus that Rosa Parks sat in when she was arrested. And this bus is in the Henry Ford Museum. I hope all of you know. And if you go now, because this was taken a couple of years ago, you can actually get in the bus and sit there. And I sat in approximately the seat where she was sitting because they're trying to they had it reupholstered, and they're trying to wear down all the leather. So they want people to come and sit in it. So you can actually sit in this bus. But many people think that that was the beginning of the civil rights movement. But it took place ages and ages ago, and I addressed that in my prologue. I hope you do read the prologues in books because there's a lot of good information in there. But the history of the struggle for civil rights in the United States, the attempt by African Americans to possess basic rights of American citizenship that were denied to them based upon racial discrimination can be studied through the progression of lawsuits filed by black passengers challenging segregation or the separation of blacks and whites on the nation's railroads, particularly when traveling in the South. It was after 1865, following the end of the Civil War and during the time known as Reconstruction, that African Americans sought to enjoy equal rights as citizens, not just in the states and towns where they lived, but also when traveling throughout the country. During the 19th and much of the 20th centuries, black Americans were generally referred to as colored. When traveling in the North, colored passengers could sit according to the class or type of ticket they purchased. The problem came when traveling in the South. Black and white travelers could not sit in the same train cars. And if a train ride started in a northern state, when the train entered a southern state or crossed what was called the Mason-Dixon line, black passengers were made to leave their seats and sit in an all-black or colored train car. Over the years, a large number of lawsuits were filed by African American passengers who had been forced, often dragged, from their seats and into colored cars, segregated cars, when traveling on Southern rail lines. However, the law of the land was established by the 1896 U.S. Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson. That case held that states had the right to require separate but equal seating for black passengers. This segregation was enforced by what was known as Jim Crow laws in the South and extended far beyond separate seating on train cars. The effects of the court decision in Plessy versus Ferguson and the notion of separate versus equal, or separate but equal, were far-reaching, leaving very few aspects of American public life untouched. It remained the law of the land in the United States for decades to come. So one of the things I really want my readers, and if I go to events such as this, to know is that it began before 1955, that people were filing lawsuits. They were being dragged from train cars because they didn't feel like if they had bought a first-class seat, they should have to sit in the colored car. So please know that even though what happened in Montgomery was a marvelous thing, and it really, as we know it, the civil rights movement began then, it really began decades before then, and technically 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, my son, he lives in Pittsburgh. He's a copy editor for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And so, as a good mom, I look at the Post-Gazette every day to see, as a copy editor, you kind of rewrite the stories, you do fact-checking, you do the headlines, so I like to see what he's doing. But there was one photo in particular I saw, and I said, oh my goodness, I don't believe that this is here, and you can come look at it. But this is a picture of a steam engine, the kind that I write about in this book, The Colored Car. And this just took place a year ago, and it's going in front of their very modern convention center, kind of like our Cobo Center. And I said, how great is this, that here is, where else are you going to see this? Here is a steam engine in front of a modern convention center. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do now, is to bridge these two time frames, 1937, which is when the colored car takes place, and 2014, the time we live in now. And how often are you going to see that? But just keep that in mind as you hear me reading. I also have a photo, kind of proud of this myself. This is a quilt I made, hand quilted, hand pieced. Does anyone here quilt? Okay, so you know what I'm talking about when I said I hand pieced it, hand quilted it. Now I have to be honest, my hand quilting is so bad, my mother made me stop. And she said she and my sister were going to do it. So, and you can kind of look, but I like this because, and I kind of talk about it in the book where, my mother and her sister do it correctly. You do it under the quilt, and you push it with your middle finger that has a thimble on it, and you go up and down, and they're able to get these teeny tiny stitches. I couldn't, but why I like this is because I was able to do it as they would have done it in 1937. Okay, so that was my way of bridging the time gap, doing it then. Now, I learned to quilt from my aunt, who is called Patsy in the book, and now my aunt does quilts on the sewing machine, and I have a hand-pieced one and I have one on the machine. But that's one way that I bridged it. I bridged the gap. And here's another marvelous way that the gap was bridged. One of my readers wrote me on Facebook, and she told me in chapter 1 I have a recipe for piccalilli, which is an old-fashioned kind of relish, and some of the folks from the South call it cha-cha. She said, I made some piccalilli from your recipe. I said, would you please take a photo and send it to me so I can use it? So this is a recipe from the 1930s. A reader from 2013 actually used this recipe. So I just felt very good in that she had bridged the gap of the generations in using that recipe that was in the book. Now, what I did in researching, and my husband, bless his heart, he's a historian, and so he helps me a lot. And we went down to Cincinnati, to the train station that was down there. And we took a photo of the train station. And also you can go, they've did a marvelous job of keeping it in good shape, and it's a museum now. So we went there to the museum, and it's still used as a train station. But my husband took a photo of me in front of this train station, which is how I kind of try to get a feeling for the era. Even though I can't go back there literally, I can get a feeling for it. They still have the huge marble columns, and you can still see the windows where the tickets were purchased. Now, here is the Michigan Central Station here in Detroit, which was not turned into a museum, but you can see it's just the decrepit mess. And I'm sure most of you have seen it. That's one of our famous eyesores that when people come from all over the world, they make sure they take a picture of this. And sometimes I go down there and I tell them, there are other things you can take photos of, and I tell them other nice things in Detroit neighborhoods, and go to the DIA or something. Why do you want to take this picture? But then I was there taking pictures too, so. But that was for a purpose, to use in presentations like this. But this is how I try to bridge the time travel gap. And I also remember, as a young child, my mother was going to New York. Her brother, Doug, in the book, her brother's wife had died, and she was taking a train. And I remember as a young girl going to the Michigan Central Station, and it was bustling. It would just be like going to Metro Airport now. Only it was beautiful, with the columns, the marble columns, and there were restaurants and there were stores. And so I remember that. And so that kind of helped inform the memories I was bringing when I was writing this book. So I invite you really to live history, whether it's through reading my books, whether it's through going to some of these historic sites that are in our midst, that are in the metropolitan area. You don't even have to go to a museum. You don't have to go to the Henry Ford. You can just see it right here and experience. And I invite you to do that. Before I get into the book itself, I want to tell you a little bit more about myself. I don't know if anyone's been to my website, but I'm a lifelong Michiganian. I was born in Detroit, raised in Detroit, educated in Detroit public schools. I attended the University of Michigan, had an undergrad degree in English, and then I attended University of Detroit for law school. Now it's called University of Detroit Mercy, but at the time it was just U of D. I practiced law for a few years, and then after I got married and had kids, I wanted to do something home-based. So I decided to fall back on my English degree, and I became a professional writer. I started writing essays, and some of my essays are in national publications such as Ms. Magazine, Christian Science Monitor. And I also started writing juvenile testing passages. I kind of went in the back door of writing for young people. And when you take some of the young people, you take the MEET tests or these standardized tests, well, they hire professional writers to write those passages. And that's how I cut my teeth writing for young people. I had a very good editor. She helped train me. And that's where I developed my motto of writing for young people, which is do no harm. Do no harm. And I got that because when you're writing these passages, they give you a whole list of topics you cannot write about. Can't write about anything that would make the young reader, when they're taking the test, think about anything other than doing their best on their test. So you can't write about anything that would make them sad. Death, divorce, injury, fighting, nothing mean or evil or sad. And so that's how I developed that, because even though there are a lot of books out there, and I don't believe in censorship, but I believe that there are some books for young people that do more harm than good. And I think it's up to us as parents to make sure our kids aren't reading those books at an inappropriate age. But that's just me as a parent. But what I try to do is I try to give my readers, my young readers, an intelligent, challenging reading. But because of that, I also have a lot of adult readers, because adults can appreciate my topics, they can appreciate my reading. So I kind of span the generations. But that's how my motto, that's how I approach writing for young people, is do no harm. And in the meantime, after writing these testing services, I also started editing books for other people. If you go on Amazon.com, you'll see a list of books that I've edited. Some of them I'm credited as editor, but I actually wrote the whole book. I also did some ghost writing, which isn't writing ghost stories, but it's writing books for other people, but their name is credited. So there's some prominent people in business, prominent people in the religious circles who write a lot of books. And maybe you wonder, how do they have time to write books? They're so busy. Well, it's because they don't. They don't write them. They hire, or the publishers will hire people like me to write it for them. And so I've done that quite a bit. I will say, though, I like to point out there's one prominent person who does not use a ghostwriter. Can anyone guess who that is? Very prominent American. Our president, Barack Obama. All of his books have been written. He writes all of his books himself. He does not use a ghostwriter. But most other folks, you can rest assured, it probably was a ghostwriter. So I'm going to start now with the colored car. I like, as I said, to take my readers back to 1937, my time machine. I did extensive research. It did help that my husband is a historian. He teaches history both high school and at Wayne State University. And so he has, at the university, we can keep out books for like 3 months. So I go there, I do extensive research there. Also the Burton Historical Library. Anyone can go use that, and I really encourage you to go there, because I went and I took out their Michigan Central box, and I could actually see tickets. They have tickets there from the 30s, and I could read them, I could see them. They have actual photos there. And so I really kind of immersed myself in that to get a feel for the time. And this is in addition to, as I'll explain later, information that I had heard from my parents and from my aunts and uncles and my grandparents. Also, there's a chapter in the colored car that takes place in Clarksville, Tennessee. And so I wanted to make it as authentic as possible. Well, when I told you about the story of going down to Memphis, Tennessee, and I was the Yankee. One of the students there, one of the classes, one of the students had his mother teaches at the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss. And so she bought all the books for her son, and she read them and loved them. She teaches social studies methods classes in the College of Education there. So the last few years, ever since there has been a Skype, I've been doing Skype visits with her students. So when I was in the midst of writing the colored car, I emailed her and I asked her, I said, your next Skype visit, I would really like to pick your students' brains, and I want to get some Tennessee sayings, I said. So she said, sure, and I talked to her, and the first thing they did was correct me. They said, there is no such thing as Tennessee sayings. It's Southern sayings. You know, it's a Southern culture. You know, they're all interlocked. So they gave me all these sayings, and you'll read some of them in the chapter that's called Clarksville, Tennessee. Well, it's not called, but it's in Well, part of it's in the color car and part of it's in the chapter Clarksville, Tennessee. But some of the sayings are full as a tick. You ever hear that? Full as a tick. Fat road. Can you imagine what that's a wide road. You know, like Grand River or something like that. And then one of the students, her husband, gave me some pronunciation prompts, because one of the sayings that he told her was, something is on like a pot of neck bones. But he said, on is pronounced like own, O-W-N. So it's on like a pot of neck bones, okay? So anyway, it was fun. But all that to say is I have some authenticity to it. I had some authentic feedback from these students. But most importantly, when I was going through and putting the book together, were the oral histories that I took of my family. And some of these, they came when I was so young I didn't even realize what I was doing at the time. I was just soaking all of this in. Others came during family reunions or birthdays or holiday gatherings, when I really picked my family's brain for certain information, for certain details, to make it authentic. So all of these, both of my books take place in the 30s. Every historical aspect of it is authentic. So in this book, in The Colored Car in 1937, there's a flood that takes place in Clarksville, Tennessee. There actually was a flood in 1937. In Who's Jim Hines, it takes place in 1935, and in a certain part I talk about the auto union starting. And they actually did. The UAW actually did start in 1935. So everything is historically correct when you read it. And also, what I call my lines of time. Each chapter heading is a different family occurrence or occurrence that took place within my family that is actually true. So the core of it is true. Of course, I have to embellish it and you have to kind of add it. You want a book that people are going to want to read. Otherwise, it's just like reading someone's diary. But unless it's Anne Frank's diary, who wants to read it? But with this, the core of it is true. I have what I call lines of time. I don't know if there are any literature majors here, but Marcel Proust, the French writer, he had his madeleines. He would take a bite, and just the taste of it and the scent would take him back into a certain time. Or Wordsworth, an American poet, he had what he called spots of time, these little bits of time that would inform his poems, that would kind of jar his memory. Well, I have my lines of time, and each chapter of this, each chapter heading is one of these lines of time. So what I'm going to do now is read a bit. I'm going to read from a few of the chapters. I'm not going to read the whole chapter, but just a little bit to kind of give you a flavor for The Colored Car, for the book The Colored Car, and also kind of whet your appetite, not just for this book, but for other books along that line, especially with the time period we're in now, the turn of the century, not the turn of the century because we've passed the turn of the century, but the early 21st century, and how that relates to life as it happened in the 1930s. So just a little backstory. There's my grandparents, the Ford family. May Ford, my grandmother, she's got 4 daughters and a son, and she finds out that her mother and sisters in Clarksville, they may have had a little more damage during the flood and than they're letting on. And so she decides to take her daughters down to Clarksville, and she gets them ready. My grandfather goes to the Michigan Central Station, buys the tickets, and so they're on this first-class car, and they've had little tea cookies and their plush seats and whatnot. And so in the middle, they've just landed in, or just stopped, not landed, but they've stopped in Cincinnati. All right, girls, May Ford instructed, gather up your things, get up now, put on your gloves, make sure you have your handkerchiefs. Do you have any peppermints left? No, I didn't think so. Come on, let's go. Patsy and her sister stood and did as they were told. They put on their white gloves and held tight to their handkerchiefs. With baby Annie Mae in her arm, their mother led them off of the train. That same conductor was standing there as they left the car. He directed them and the other colored passengers who were leaving their train cars. This way to the colored car. What's the colored car, Mama? Patsy asked. Patsy, you take Laura's hand, their mother said. Follow close to me. It was almost midnight, but the heat was still stifling. With Annie still in her arm, Mae wiped her forehead and the back of her neck with her handkerchief. Then she took Jean's hand. They walked into the crowd of people on the platform. Some were standing, some walking, some seated on benches. Here we go, girls. We won't have to walk too far, I don't think, their mother said. They walked up to a car. Mae Ford looked up. Patsy followed her mother's gaze. Above the steps to the train car was a sign with the word colored on it. Last call for Louisville, Clarksville, and Nashville. This is it. Patsy, you and Laura, go on in now, their mother said. I'm right behind you. They stood behind a line of passengers, all colored, who were getting on the train car. Patsy led her sister into the car. She stopped in the doorway. It took just a few seconds for her to take it all in. The floor was bare and worn, and there were rows of old wooden seats. There was no upholstery, no curtains, no cushions. A rusty pot-bellied stove was situated in the middle of the car. There was soot in the air, and she started to cough. She looked up at her mother and said, Mama, this car's dirty. Our dresses will get dirty. Let's go back to the other one. We can't do that. Come on and make the best of it. As Mae Ford led the other girls to their seats, Patsy stood in the doorway. But it's dirty, Mama. Let's go back to the other car. Why couldn't we just stay in that car, Patsy asked. There were other people staying in that car. Take your seat, Patsy. This is where we'll be until we get to Clarksville, her mother said. Patsy turned and went back down the stairs and stood on the platform. The mother looked at the other girls and commanded, Stay right here, girls. Then she joined Patsy on the platform and grabbed her daughter's arm. Patsy, what's gotten into you? You can't go running off like that. Now get back on the train. Patsy pulled away. Mama, that train car smells. It's dirty. It made me cough. The seats are all crowded together. There are no cushions on the seats. How can we ride all the way to Clarksville in that colored car? Oh, sweetheart, it won't be so bad. You'll fall asleep. We'll be there before you know it, bright and early in the morning. All aboard? No, Mama. Get Laura and Jean and the baby. Let's go back. Patsy's voice was shaking. Patsy, now stop it. We cannot go back to the other car. We have to ride in this car. We have to ride in the colored car. But why, Mama? Why? Patsy's eyes were filled with tears. Listen, baby. When we leave Cincinnati, we'll be in the South. In the North, where we live, colored people and white people can sit on any train they want. In the South, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, all the southern states, they want colored people to sit on the train with other colored people. Patsy's mouth dropped open. That's why there were mostly colored people getting off of our train, but I saw some white people getting off too. They probably had business or family in Cincinnati, her mother explained, but if they didn't have to leave their seats. Let's get a move on. The gruff voice behind them belonged to the conductor. We'll be on presently, Mae Ford answered him. She turned to Patsy and held out her hand. Come on now. Patsy stood firm. I don't want to sit in the colored car. Please, child, come on. Patsy looked up and saw Laura and Jean looking out the window. She wanted to be with her sisters, but not in the colored car. Everybody in the car. It was the conductor again. Come on, Patsy. Her mother's voice was firm now, no longer pleading. Sweat was beading up on her forehead. If you can't get her up in that car, I will, the conductor said, reaching for Patsy's arm. Don't touch my daughter, sir, Mae Ford said sternly. The conductor stepped back and looked Mae straight in the eyes. Veins were bulging out on his forehead. His white face seemed to turn almost purple. What did you say to me? He demanded. I said, don't touch my daughter. Mae's voice was cold. Patsy stepped away from the conductor's reach. She was shaking. By that point, people walking by on the platform, colored and white, had stopped and were watching. All right, well, that's your introduction to Patsy and the change and the colored car. Now, once they got home and they got back to Detroit, Patsy then was still trying to internalize what she had experienced, both in the colored car and in Clarksville, Tennessee. And yet she had to get back into life as she knew it. Well, part of life as she knew it was my grandmother canned in the summer fruits and vegetables. And she literally canned 1,000 jars every summer. And so there's a chapter that I call 1,000 Jars. And this is when May Fort was canning. And there was a street vendor who used to go by in his car, and they called him the Cherry Man. And that's where my grandfather would buy most of the fruits and vegetables that my grandmother used for her canning. And so we're going to see now how Patsy understands something, not just she's internalizing and trying to work through her experiences in the South, but now she's confronting some bit of injustices here in her hometown of Detroit. May finished straining the rest of the grape liquid and leaned way forward, putting her nose closer to the bushel basket. She began lifting bunches of grapes and putting them in the buckets of rinse water. Then she shrieked, "Good Lord, would you look at this?" Patsy threw her quilting down on the bench and rushed over. Mrs. Chambers leaned over the basket, shaking her head, said, "Have mercy." Patsy stood between the two women and saw what they saw. At the bottom of the basket was a large pile of moldy, rancid grapes. Instead of a bright purple color, they were covered with a black and white fungus. The grapes themselves were almost a brown color. The smell made Patsy feel sick to her stomach. She quickly stepped back, holding her hand up to her mouth. "Douglas," Mayford called out, running to the doorway. "Douglas!" The whir of the saw stopped. Laura, Jean, and Annie Mae came running into the front room and ran straight to the bushel basket, peering in. "Yuck, pew!" the two younger girls screamed. Annie Mae bent over deep into the bushel basket. "What's in there, Mama?" Her mother stepped quickly over to the basket and pulled her back. "Goodness, don't fall in there, Annie." "Mama, I told you those grapes smelled funny," Laura said, holding her sleeve up to her nose. "Douglas," Mayford called again, this time from where she stood at the basket. "Come in here right away. There's something you need to see." Douglas Ford strode into the summer kitchen where she spoke. He peered into the basket and shook his head. "That looks bad," he said, "but I'll take care of it," he said. "Giuseppe's coming by this evening to talk about selling that truck of his. I'll see to it then." Doug burst in through the back door. "The Cherry Man just pulled up," he announced. Their father left the kitchen without saying a word. Doug stood next to Patsy as they both peered out the kitchen window. Mayford watched from where she stood at the sink. The Cherry Man and their father shook hands. "Come, Mr. Ford, I come by for you to look at the truck." He spoke with a thick Italian accent. "See, it's parked right over here." "Giuseppe, I want you to see this bushel of grapes here," Douglas Ford said, interrupting and pointing to the basket. Douglas walked with him over to the saw. He stood next to him as he peered down into the basket. The Cherry Man shook his head. "Mr. Ford, I don't know what happened. You know I give you good produce for your wife." He scratched the back of his head. "That last bushel of sweet peppers you gave me looked like half the basket was spoiled as well. I picked them out before I gave the basket to my wife. I didn't say anything to you then because I figured it was a mistake. Now it's starting to look like a pattern." "Oh, no, Mr. Ford. Mr. Ford, you know I bring you the best fruit in the city." "That's what I like to think," Douglas said to him. "I bring another basket, a bushel basket, tomorrow morning. Everything will be fine, I promise," he said. "Promise. Now, please, come look at the truck." "Giuseppe, the deal's off with the truck," Douglas Ford said. Still watching from the kitchen window, Patsy gasped and put her hand up to her mouth. Doug leaned in closer to the window screen. "My goodness," May whispered, wiping her forehead with her apron. "Oh, no, Mr. Ford, please, I promise to bring you more grapes tomorrow." "That's it, Giuseppe. The deal's off. If I can't depend on you to bring decent fruit for my family, I'm not going to take a chance on that truck of yours." "I drive it every day. The truck is good. You have my word." Douglas Ford picked up the bushel of grapes and handed the basket to the Cherry Man. "Take these with you," he said. He turned and walked toward the back door. Doug and Patsy looked at their father as he walked into the kitchen. He sat down at the kitchen table. "May," he said, turning to his wife, "I'd like a nice cool glass of lemonade." So at this point, Patsy is seeing that even though she's back home, she's noticing now things aren't going as smoothly as perhaps they were the first time, that there's something, that there are things going wrong now in her home and in her hometown. And then there's another portion of my family's history, and this is a story that I heard quite a bit. My grandfather, he had a wood business. And part of that wood business required him to have a saw in the part of his yard that he had the wood pile. And what they would do is go to the different auto factories around town. And during that time, everything was delivered in these huge wooden crates. So what he and his drivers would do would go to these factories. They would take the crates. They would be allowed to go in and take the crates. They would break them apart, fill their trucks, and then at his wood yard, he would cut them up and sell them for kindling, for wood, for people's wood-burning stoves, because that's how folks heated their houses during those days, primarily with wood. And so during this time, they would, he would have the saw, and he would have to cut it up. He usually did this in the late afternoon or evenings. And at this point, though, some of the neighbors took him to court because they got tired of the noise of the saw. Now, these were the same neighbors that in the cold, in the winter, when they couldn't afford wood or couldn't afford to heat their stoves, their wood-burning stoves, my grandfather would just give them wood. Or in other times, if they didn't have the wood for their cook stoves, he would give them wood. Or he would hire folks in the neighborhood to if they had a truck, to either bring their truck or to drive one of his trucks. So these same neighbors took him to court, and the neighborhood was racially mixed. One of the few in the city. There were blacks from the South, there were Eastern Europeans, immigrants that had just come over. So it was a racially mixed neighborhood. Black and white neighbors had taken him to court. And so during this time, when they filed a petition and they took him to court, Patsy was there, and she got to see something about another aspect of unfairness, but also another aspect of justice. So this is reading from the chapter called The Courtroom. The bailiff announced, "The court calls the plaintiffs Harold Williams, Walter Chambers, Luther Carson, George Kowalski, George Clark, Gustav Meinhof, Robert Johnson, and Joseph Smith. Please step up to the bench." Neighbors, colored and white, filed forward. They stood at the front of the room in the order in which they were called, beneath Judge DePonio's desk. But where they all stood looked more like a rail than a bench. It was a thick, heavy wooden railing that was waist high, and where some of them rested their hands. The bailiff then announced, "The court calls the defendant, Douglas Ford Sr. Please step up to the bench." Douglas Ford got up from his seat, walked briskly to the front of the room, and stood next to his neighbors at the opposite end of the bench from where Harold Williams stood. Next, the bailiff said, "Please raise your right hands." All the men standing raised their right hands. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" he asked. "I do," Douglas Ford and his neighbors answered. The judge sifted through some papers, then looked down at the line of men standing below him. Clearing his throat, he asked, "This is the common pleas court, a small claims court. So there's no jury box, there's no witness box. The parties to this action will stand before me, and we will proceed from here. You've all taken the oath. Who speaks for the plaintiffs?" There was a pause. "I do," answered Mr. Williams. "Please state your name and address for the court." Judge DePonio instructed them. "Williams, Harold Williams, 2050 Halleck Street, Detroit." Then he added, "Your Honor." The judge continued. "Now, according to this complaint, you and the other plaintiffs have filed an accusation of nuisance against the defendant. Please explain yourself." "Well, Your Honor," Mr. Williams began, "Mr. Ford here has a wood business and wood yard right next to his house. And he cuts up that wood of his with his big saw. And he runs that saw all day, every day, except Sunday, that is. Sometimes he's out there early in the morning. Sometimes when we're trying to get to sleep, he's running that saw in the nighttime. You can hear it all up and down the neighborhood. So we got together a petition, and folks signed it saying, we just want some peace and quiet." The judge continued, "Mr. Williams, was Mr. Ford operating this business when you moved into your home?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And the rest of the plaintiffs?" "Yes," they answered in unison. Judge DePonio paused and looked down at his papers. "And you, Mr. Ford, how do you answer the complaint?" the judge asked, shifting his focus. "Your Honor," Doug continued, "I have always been on good terms with my neighbors. I hardly ever run my saw past dark in the warmer months, and not much past dark in the winter and fall. Sometimes if I or one of my drivers has brought in an especially large load of wood the night before, I run the saw early in the morning, but that doesn't happen too often. He paused, still looking at the judge. Judge DePonio motioned with his head for him to continue. I know times are hard, so I give my neighbors wood when they ask. I don't ask for any money. They pay when they can. Sometimes they do a little work for me to pay it off. I hire them if they can drive a truck when I need an extra driver for my business. Judge DePonio read something on his desk, then he continued. Gentlemen, by your own testimony, Mr. Fort was already operating his business when each of you moved into the neighborhood. In other words, he was living in the neighborhood and running his business, cutting wood with his saw before any of you moved there. You chose to move in and therefore cannot complain about a condition that was already existing. Furthermore, he leaned forward as he spoke, if Mr. Fort can't operate his saw, he can't run his business. And you gentlemen, and I dare say many more of your neighbors, have all benefited greatly from his business. Mr. Fort has not only supported his own family, but has helped all of you care for yours and support yours. Now, the Common Pleas Court is a court of equity. So while the noise from the saw, according to the law, might indeed disturb the peace of the neighborhood, considering all of the facts of this case, the noise from the saw and the wood business is mitigated by all of the benefits Mr. Ford and his business have provided to you who are assembled here, as well as the entire community. Judge DePonio hit his gavel hard against the large wooden block and declared, I find no merit in the plaintiff's complaint of nuisance against the defendant. Case dismissed. The judge stood up from his seat. May Fort let out a sigh of relief as she reached over and squeezed Patsy's hand. All rise, the bailiff instructed. The judge exited the courtroom. There was murmuring as the courtroom began to empty out. A few of the plaintiffs, including Mr. Williams, went to their seats to retrieve their hats. He had to walk past Douglas Fort before he could leave the room. Harold, Douglas said. Harold Williams looked startled and a little fearful. He glanced over at the plaintiff. I'm not going to hurt you, Douglas assured him. I got my justice here. I have no axe to grind with you. I just want to know, who put you up to this? What are you talking about? What do you mean? Harold asked. Oh, come on, Harold. Just tell me. Who got you to start the petition? File the nuisance complaint. Just tell me. Harold looked down at the floor, fingering the rim of his hat. It was that Italian fella. He drives the fruit truck. Giuseppe? Douglas asked. May Ford, who was standing nearby, gasped. Giuseppe, Harold stammered. He said we shouldn't have to put up with that noise. He said it was a nuisance and the neighborhood would be better. Douglas held up the palm of his hand and cut him off. He looked Harold straight in the eyes. Did he pay you? There was silence. Yes, Harold whispered. He turned away and left the courtroom. Lord have mercy, Douglas Ford said, shaking his head. Patsy moved in closer to her father. Daddy, the cherry man paid him to take you to court? Yes, child, he answered. So are you going to do anything about the cherry man? Do anything? What's there to do? The case was thrown out of court. Whatever he wanted to happen didn't happen. You heard me tell Mr. Williams, I got justice. I just hope and pray this is the last of this mess. He motioned for May and Patsy to join him as he headed toward the door. So as you can see, Patsy is learning a little bit more about justice in her life, justice in her hometown. And this is particularly after her experience in the South with the colored car. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. You've been a great audience. I will be in the back. If anyone would like to purchase a copy, I'd love to autograph it for you. And thanks to Margie and Christina for having me here tonight. Thanks a lot.